Good evening. I'm Bob Hauer. Welcome to Oklahoma December. Tonight, the Oil in Oklahoma series continues, and you'll be seeing some of the most fascinating events in the history of Oklahoma. You see actual film of the wildest oil well of them all, the Mary Sudic. You'll hear the words of Governor E.W. Marland as he explains circumstances leading up to oil derricks surrounding our state capital. This and more as we present the last of the boom towns, Oklahoma City and Seminole, tonight on Oklahoma December.
This place used to be nothing more than just a flag stop on the Santa Fe Railroad. It didn't even have a name. This is how it looked on the morning of April 22nd, 1889. Since then, it's made some kind of change, and oil made it possible. This is Oklahoma City. The founding of Oklahoma's largest city actually began about 30 miles north of its present location. And in 1889, that was the northern border of the unassigned lands of Oklahoma Territory, about 2 million acres that had not been set aside for Indians. Benjamin Harrison had been President of the United States only 3 weeks when he signed a proclamation opening up all of the unassigned lands under the provisions of the country's homestead laws, which were quite simple: 160 acres free to anybody willing to work them. And by April that year, thousands had signed up for Oklahoma's first great land run. On April 22nd, 1889, there were 50,000 of them on the northern border, stretched out for miles on either side. And they had got there by just about every imaginable means, some on horseback buckboard, some came by train, one man on a bicycle. He would use that in the run. Never before, probably, at least since the California Gold Rush, had so many people come together with one purpose in mind: to improve their way of life, their standard of living. The people who gathered that day represented just about every state in the Union. Now, the odds that they would improve their lives were good, but of course there were those who wanted even better odds, who wanted to sneak in the territory early and claim the choicest land. Now, to prevent that, the Army set up perimeters, but some got in anyway, thus the nickname Sooners. The starting signal, Army bugles all along the lines. That happened at noon, April 22nd, 1889. Instantly, 1,000 blurred images in red dust, and the beginning of one of the wildest, hardest to believe chapters in the history of this state, or for that matter, this country.
By sunset, it was over. The land had all been staked. Hundreds of tents had sprung up over the once barren western prairies. Where only a few hours earlier stood nothing, there were now towns like Stillwater, Guthrie, Oklahoma City. In Oklahoma City, which had been the target spot for more than 10,000 land runners, the Sooners were trying to sell their claims to newcomers for as much as $200. Ambitious merchants had already opened shop by spreading their products on the bare ground. Oklahoma City was off to a booming, if somewhat chaotic start. And one place that had a lot of both chaos and boom was the post office. This is how it quaintly looked right before the run. People picked up mail and newspapers addressed simply to Oklahoma Indian Territory. But finding mail was easier than finding water. Thousands of people were drinking directly from the muddy waters of the Canadian River, and spring water from one shallow well was selling for a nickel a cup. The need for more freshwater wells was obvious, and the first one dug after settlement was by a man using knowledge he had learned in the oil fields of eastern Pennsylvania. In fact, he was hired because he was, in the words of the time, well versed in the boring of wells for oil.
Less than a year later, the same man would drill again, this time for oil, the first serious effort to find it in Oklahoma Territory. And the spot he chose was right here, the intersection of Northwest 4th Street and the Santa Fe Railroad tracks. The necessary financing had been arranged, and the well itself was formally dedicated in the spring of 1890. Hundreds of people were in this area listening to a priest deliver a rather gusty prayer for the driller's success. The ceremony over, most of the people adjourned to a nearby clump of trees for a picnic, complete with everything, including plenty of illegal liquor. And the legend has it that most of the men got so drunk that they had to be hauled home in buckboards. In any event, the well struck about 4 months later. Not oil, but water. Yet, considering Oklahoma City's needs at the time, that was probably preferable. The population of this town in the spring of 1890 was 12,000. And even though the first effort failed, at least in intent, it nevertheless created the fever for oil, and a lot of people caught it.
During the next 40 years, a whole series of oil wells were drilled in the Oklahoma City area, all dry. Most of the efforts were legitimate, but one unscrupulous promoter was known to have driven to Tulsa to pick up several barrels of oil to pour down a dry well in Oklahoma City, giving the appearance of having discovered oil. The reactions of Tulsa oil men were amusement and condescension, but having wallowed in not only one, but two of the richest oil fields in the world, first Glenpool and Cushing, they could afford to laugh. Men like Sinclair, Cosden, Tom Slick were making millions. Even the Osage were doing better than the oil men in Oklahoma City.
Geology would make them equal. Now, at the beginning, most oilmen tended to equate geology with witchcraft. It was a smart Aleck's game for wise guys. A real oil man found it the way it should be found. Hunches, trends, just good luck. But oilmen tended to become more sophisticated in their approach toward oil, and consequently more successful, is due in large measure to Charles Gould, who made geology respectable. He founded the Department of Geology at the University of Oklahoma, considered one of the best in the world, and also the Oklahoma Geological Survey. Because of men like Gould, geology took hold, not only in Oklahoma, but in other areas where men thought there was a strong likelihood of oil. And what happened in Oklahoma City is very hard to believe. There was a man. His name was Dr. George Morgan, young, dedicated, very serious, a good geologist. He was sent to Oklahoma City because his company felt oil just might be here. Well, as it happened, he had a girlfriend who lived in Oklahoma City, and in her backyard was a cellar. Now, in those days, a cellar had two purposes. One, a place of refuge during the tornado season, and two, a place to keep all the illegal liquor. Well, one Sunday afternoon, Morgan was down in the cellar getting an illegal drink when he noticed a peculiar rock formation. Well, that and additional data convinced the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company, later a subsidiary of City Service, that oil was indeed in Oklahoma City. And they wanted to lease all the land they could. Everybody thought they were making a huge mistake, but so convinced was City Service that Oklahoma City was a likely source of oil that it sent down its top land expert, Homer Keegan. And his instructions were very simple. You lease all the good land that you possibly can.
Well, what did you think when the company said, go out, said, Mr. Keegan, I want you to go out and buy those leases? What did you think?
Well, it's just another day's work. And of course, that's part of the work. We just assigned me to that area, told me what to do, and I wanted to hurry up and get it over with. I worked day and night so I could get out of there and get back over in an area where I thought would be more profitable for the company.
Was it difficult buying leases from these people?
No, it was easy. I had to explain it to them because they didn't want to know what a gas lease was, but it wasn't difficult. It was easy to buy.
What did you tell them when you went in to buy a lease?
Well, of course, I'd explain what an oil and gas lease was, and they would get 1/8 of all the oil, and of course the operator gets 7/8.
So they got the land. The next problem was where to drill. On May 28, 1928, the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company decided that this would be the spot for Oklahoma City #1. This was part of a 40-acre tract which had been leased for $200. We're near the intersection of Southeast 59th and Bryant Avenue, and 1/2 block away from what apparently in deference to history is called ITIO Street. The rig was completed on June 9th. 6 weeks later, this well hit 35 million cubic feet of dry gas. 6 weeks later, and 1,000 feet deeper, more dry gas. By the end of November, the well was down 6,500 feet. It was slow going. And the crew was not at all convinced that it would strike oil. But the officials of ITIO were. And that sort of optimism was hard to keep a secret. Word spread throughout Oklahoma City that ITIO just might be onto something. It is now December 4th, 1928, very dark day. Clouds indicated probable thunderstorms, and a crowd which had gathered here hoping to see oil discovered for the first time, fearful of rain, began to thin out. Then there was this rumble, very slow starting, then building in volume and speed, and then it happened. Oklahoma City #1 was a gusher.
When you were drilling that well, did you ever think that the Oklahoma City #1 would be the tremendous gusher that it was?
I sure didn't. And none of the rest that is, working people. The geological department had great faith in it, had more faith than we did. But we kind of wrote it off, most our department, and it was a great surprise to us. Tremendous surprise.
During the next 30 days, Oklahoma City #1 produced more than 100,000 barrels of oil, price $1.56 a barrel. But more important, this gusher was the beginning of the Oklahoma City oil field. And in its day, this field would be the greatest producing field in the world. Tulsa oilmen would thereafter laugh not quite so much. For Oklahoma City number 1 would be followed by derrick after derrick that would rearrange the Oklahoma City skyline. One major result of that first well was that it put city service into the major leagues of the oil industry. It became the 10th largest oil company in America, with headquarters first in Bartlesville, then Tulsa, with annual production in excess of 82 million barrels and net income last year of more than $112 million. Gross sales, $2.1 billion, a long way since 1928.
About 2.5 years before the first oil well was discovered in Oklahoma City, there was another great boom about 50 miles southeast of Oklahoma City, and that's where we are now, on the edge of Seminole. And it was here that there would be the last great Oklahoma oil boom that began with Glenpool and Cushing. 47 years ago, this was a pretty sleepy village of about 200 people who lived mostly by farming. At the time, there was talk of oil and the great riches being made in eastern Oklahoma, but very few people ever thought seriously that oil would be discovered here. But it was. And the man mainly responsible was a 22-year-old adventurer named Robert Garland. In 1926, he was down on his luck. He had drilled more than his share of dry wells, but what kept him going really was the philosophy of the successful wildcatter, which was drill enough holes in the ground so long as the borrowed money holds out, and then if you're lucky, you just might find what you're looking for. It is July 1926, and Garland's attention is now centered on this area. That old riverbed, the site of Fixico number 1. An oil well that was producing nothing but unfavorable reports. Garland, in fact, was so discouraged that he tried to sell it, but nobody would buy it. So he kept drilling. It is now the 16th of July, early evening. The streets of Seminole are just about empty. Stores have closed. Practically everyone has gone home for dinner, except the men who were working on that oil well. They decided to bring up the drilling bit to check it. When it got to the surface, they went wild, for it was covered with oil. 10 days later, Fixico number 1 was producing 5,000 barrels of oil daily, and the village of Seminole and its population of 200 grew almost overnight to a population of 35,000 and became one of the wildest, one of the most uncontrollable, most legendary boom towns in the history of oil. And all because of Garland's Fixico number 1.
And not only were the people rushing towards Seminole, but also to adjacent towns like Cromwell.
What was the town like, though? I mean, it was a small town before the boom, and then all of a sudden the boom came, and here were 80,000 people now living in Seminole. How did the city handle that many people?
Oh, the tents pitched every place, in the alleys, up and down the streets. We had tent houses that, for a member, probably paid 25 cents for a cot a night, cot houses and tent houses. And then they just threw up little shotgun buildings, almost built them overnight, tar paper and cheap lumber. And then besides that, they were spread all over the countryside around Seminole. You'd hardly know where the city limits would be. The houses were so thick out in the country in tents. Covered wagons everywhere in the world to live, you might say, there exists. But, our chicken house, we converted our chicken house into rental property and for people to live in. The garage was converted. And my wife screened in, boxed in one of the front porches and rented that out to people. They managed.
When you look back at that period of time, 40 years ago or so, was that a happy period of time for this city?
It sure was. People were employed and wanted to work then. They don't now, you know. Made a difference.
Most of the people who came to Seminole came to work in the fields, but right behind them were the gamblers, the bootleggers, the dance hall operators, the common thieves and thugs. They set up headquarters just north of the city, an area called Bishop's Alley, and it was loaded with bars, dance halls. The most popular was a place called the Palace, where roustabouts could dance with a girl for 25 cents a minute. Everywhere there was money, or at least talk of money.
Well, it was booming. It is. You'd open up of a morning and you never would get your lobby cleared till you just closed the door on them. And that evening we stayed open till about 5 o'clock, you know, and it was just when I went to work the bank there, we had about 3 employees, and we'd hire about 1 a week. We never could hire enough, you know. We'd just keep adding more people, and it was just the boom would come on so fast, you see.
Well, you just didn't have time to think. You didn't know what to do. People was just going and coming. There's wanting homes to live in. There's wanting places to live in. Now, I had the ITIO oil company. Well, I'd furnished them room and house. And their main office was right south of my home. And I had a lot of their people living in furnished rooms. And then, as I said, I moved in a big house and made it into sleeping apartments for their men. I had a lot of dealings with the ITIO oil company.
Seminole had other problems besides fires in the oil fields. Room space was critical, so critical that beds were rented out in shifts, 2 men to each bed for 8 hours, or 6 different men sleeping on the same bed every day. There was also a lack of fresh water for drinking and cooking, and the post office was constantly jammed. Before the boom, immediate service, now a day-long wait to pick up a single letter. Not everybody cared for what was happening in Seminole, much less for the kind of people it was bringing in.
What did you think of all these oil roustabouts and other types of people coming in for this boom?
Well, I tell you frankly, I was just living until I could get away. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I didn't think I'd be here long. If I used anything out of the trunk, I put it right back. I could have put my hat on and left in 15 minutes if I'd been told that we were moving. And that, I really think that was all that held me together. Was if anyone had told me would eventually retire here, I just couldn't have believed it.
You weren't very fond of Seminole at that time.
No, I wasn't. I don't know anyone who was.
Why?
Oh, conditions were terrible. There was not enough water. The water would give out. And there was crime. There was so much crime. You were afraid to be out at night. To walk down the street was an adventure. You didn't just walk down the street. You just went along. You saw an opening. You went through that, and you just crawled along. And it was horrible. And mud.
Mud, the unforgettable boom image. When the oil came, there wasn't one paved road in Seminole. Not so bad itself, maybe. But the spring of 1927 was one of the rainiest ever, and the roads became giant obstacles of mud so deep that horses would slip and drown right in the middle of the street. To this day, the legend persists that beneath the main street in Seminole, there is a team and a wagon buried in the mud of 1927. By September 29, Seminole was the nation's #1 high-gravity oil field. Since the first well 3 years earlier, Seminole had brought in more than $300 million, and the town had done some kind of growing up. The mud was paved over with concrete, sidewalks were built, new buildings went up in place of shanties, and electricity came in. Before the boom, Seminole's only real connection with the outside world was as a flag stop on the Rock Island Railroad. Now the town was doing more than $1 million of business a month for the railroad, more than the city of Chicago. The Seminole Post Office had set the world's record for writing money orders for one 3-month period, only to break its own record the following quarter. The oil field itself had grown from just Seminole City to become Greater Seminole, which included nearby small towns like Cromwell, Wewoka, and Bowlegs. Money was flowing freely, with the oil field payroll more than $600,000 a week. But the wild, ruckus days were over. Now a person could walk at night and live to tell about it. In time, Seminole settled into a modern industrial town. Oil is still the major industry, and Seminole is still very special, for it was the last truly great boom town in this country. As things were beginning to level off in Seminole, Oklahoma City was moving like no other field. 6 months after the Oklahoma City discovery well, 2 more gushers were found, one by Harry Sinclair. From then on, gusher after gusher. No other field had had such spectacular success. 90% of all wells drilled hit oil, the most phenomenal record in the history of petroleum. Oklahoma City was one of the fastest growing cities in America. The city was literally covered with the spray from oil gushers.
To the average person today, perhaps the name Mary Sudick doesn't mean too much, but it meant a lot 40 years ago. In fact, it got world publicity as the wildest oil well in history. And that well, as much as anything else probably, made this nation conscious of Oklahoma City as an oil town. The well was named after Mary Sudick, who, along with her husband Vance, owned a farm south of Oklahoma City. The Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company wanted to lease the Sudick land very badly, so much so, in fact, that it sent in its top land expert, Homer Keegan, to try to swing the deal. Now, as he remembers it, the Sudicks were not too willing to sign. In fact, they didn't want to at all. But being a good oil man, Keegan was persistent and told them, "I'm not leaving this house until you do." Cordially, I suppose. Anyway, they invited him to dinner. Afterwards, he stayed and stayed. Finally, 2 hours passed. Then the Sudicks, apparently believing the only way to get rid of this guy was to sign the lease, did so for 5 years. The derrick was completed in June 1929, and the slow, arduous task of drilling thousands of feet continued until May 26, 1930. Then drilling stopped. Several crewmen retrieved some tools from the well to prepare a new joint. Suddenly, there was a terrible roar. An enormous volume of gas shot up through the well, and all hell broke loose.
Workmen tried to stop it but couldn't, for the gas was roaring out at 2,700 pounds per square inch, enough force to lift up and blow away a 40-pound steel block. Overnight, the gas changed to a black spray that showered the countryside, covering everything in its path, all the way to Norman, 11 miles south, and some people, as far south as Purcell, would later say that they heard the first roar. The gusher was shooting 175 feet into the air, and more than 100,000 persons gathered to watch. Newspapermen were there, as well as motion picture crews, and radio broadcaster Floyd Gibbons, whose specialty was natural disasters, covered the event live for NBC. The steady roar was so great that workmen near the gusher had to stuff cotton and grease into their ears to avoid going deaf. As the well continued out of control, the crowds were pushed back, for fire was now a great hazard. So were explosions. More than 100 drilling wells were shut down as the state set up a fire zone a half-mile north of the well, and people living in homes near the Mary Sudick couldn't even light a match to start their ovens. For 5 days, workmen had tried but couldn't shut it off. On the 6th day, April 1st, the wind shifted, blowing the oil directly over Oklahoma City. The National Guard was mobilized to help police keep people out of the danger zone. But by nightfall, the Mary Sudick was under control, and exhausted work crews rested easy for the first time in 6 days. But during the night, the master gate began to leak. By morning, oil and gas were shooting out in several directions, and that afternoon, the Mary Sudick was wild again. Everything was being done to reclaim the wasted oil. Earthen pits and tanks were built to capture it, and 211,000 barrels were eventually saved. By April 4th, the well was again under control, but again the victory was short. That night, a crevice appeared in the new packing, and as it widened, a deadly spray of sand and oil shot out in all directions. Engineers and mechanics were working night and day to construct a stronger locking device, and by April 6th, it was ready. The new connection was placed over the surface pipe, and it held, and gradually, the oil and gas diminished to a trickle. One more tight turn, and it was over. It was 7 p.m., April 6th, 1930. And the wild Mary Sudick well was conquered after 11 and a half days. Oilmen called it the most marvelous well in history. In the next 6 years, it never again caused trouble, but did produce nearly 800,000 barrels of oil before it was finally capped. By now, the United States was in the midst of a Great Depression. It was difficult everywhere, but less so for Oklahoma City. And the reason was oil. And the symbol of oil was the Mary Sudic.
The founding of Oklahoma's largest city actually began about 30 miles north of its present location. And in 1889, that was the northern border of the unassigned lands of Oklahoma Territory, about 2 million acres that had not been set aside for Indians. The run. Never before, probably, at least since the California Gold Rush, had so many people come together with one purpose in mind: to improve their way of life, their standard of living. The people who gathered that day represented just about every state in the Union. Now, the odds that they would improve their lives were good, but of course there were those who wanted even better odds, who wanted to sneak in the territory early and claim the choicest land. Now, to prevent that, the Army set up perimeters, but some got in anyway, thus the nickname Sooners. The starting signal, Army bugles all along the line. Benjamin Harrison had been President of the United States only 3 weeks when he signed a proclamation opening up all of the unassigned lands under the provisions of the country's homestead laws, which were quite simple: 160 acres free to anybody willing to work them. And by April that year, thousands had signed up for Oklahoma's first great land run. On April 22nd, 1889, there were 50,000 of them on the northern border, stretched out for miles on either side. And they had got there by just about every imaginable means, some on horseback buckboard, some came by train, one man on a bicycle. He would use that.
Good evening. I'm Bob Hauer. Welcome to Oklahoma December. Tonight, the Oil in Oklahoma series continues, and you'll be seeing some of the most fascinating events in the history of Oklahoma. You'll see actual film of the wildest oil well of them all, the Mary Sudic. You'll hear the words of Governor E.W. Marland as he explains circumstances leading up to oil derricks surrounding our state capital. This and more as we present the last of the boom towns, Oklahoma City and Seminole, tonight on Oklahoma December.
This place used to be nothing more than just a flag stop on the Santa Fe Railroad. It didn't even have a name. This is how it looked on the morning of April 22nd, 1889. Since then, it's made some kind of change, and oil made it possible. This is Oklahoma City.